So my name is Dr. Carrie Kemp. I am a third-year postdoctoral scholar at UAB. I did my bachelor's degree in my home state of Kansas at Kansas State University quite a while ago. And then I went on to I took actually a lot of time off between my undergraduate degree and going back to graduate school, in which I worked. So, I worked multiple jobs, and then I decided I wanted to return to graduate school. So I want you guys to know that that's possible, and not everybody's path is linear. And so I went back for a master's degree and got a master's degree at Georgia Tech in 2011, and then I went on to do a PhD at the University of Georgia, and those were both in environmental sciences and ecology. And I was studying the relationship between environmental bacteria and how they interact with animals in the environment. So I worked on reef-building corals that live in the ocean and are part of coral reefs. So they have their own bacteria. Hold on one second. My husband is here. I'm going to shut my door.
Okay.
Okay, so everybody works from home for periods because of COVID right now. So and then I after my doctoral experience, I decided I really liked kind of that question of working with bacteria and how bacteria are interacting with, I call them their hosts. So we humans have as many microbial cells in and on our body as our own human cells. And so our bacteria play a really crucial role in our health and our metabolism and our immunity. So I decided that I wanted to kind of go more of a biomedical route in my postdoctoral research. And so that's what I'm doing now. So I'm looking at the gut microbiota and how they're playing a role in our overall health and our stress response. So actually, how do we respond to psychological stress? And I'm really interested in stress that you are experiencing in early life, and kind of how that might be affecting your gut microbiota, and then setting you up for kind of predisposing you for risks later in life, like developing cardiovascular disease. So that's kind of my current line of research that I'm working on. And I work in mouse models, but I also I work with clinicians who are collecting surveys and samples from patients at the Children's Hospital at UAB. And so it's very exciting for me. So that's my background. So you can see that, I got a bachelor's degree in biology, but I took off, almost 10 years before going back to graduate school, where I worked different jobs, not all science, and before I decided to go back to school. And then you can kind of see, even once I decided to go back to graduate school, I've kind of changed research topics over the years. And so I think that's actually pretty common. So again, not everybody's path is linear. So I'll go ahead and take us to the next slide here as people are joining. Now, how many do we have enough participants to kind of start, do you think?
Oh, yes. Let's go ahead and start.
Yeah, let's fill in because we're 6 minutes after, so we want to make sure we have enough time. But these are our objectives today. And so after kind of sitting through this session with me, you're going to be able to identify types of sources. And these are kind of scientific peer-reviewed sources. And then you're going to know how to search for them and how to evaluate them. So these are our objectives, and this is our outline for today's talk. And please chime in with chats at any time. Let me see, can I pull up? Yeah, I can pull up the chat button here, I think. If someone writes a question, will it just show up? Yeah. Okay. Yes, I see. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can write them there in the chat and I'll respond. And so to get started, it's kind of important to know types of sources that are out there and basically where in the cycle you're getting the information from. So like, are you getting the information from the primary source, the person that produced it, or are you getting it secondhand or even third hand? So we can talk about primary sources, secondary sources, and tertiary sources. And you can actually kind of map, like if you're reading a secondary source or a tertiary source, you can kind of follow a map back to the original source that's being cited. So let's kind of talk about, give an overview of what these types of sources are. So primary sources are articles that present the original research done by the people that carried it out themselves. And so these are our primarily research articles if you're talking about a scientific article. And one thing for you to know is that there are a ton of different scientific journals out there for different types of science that's conducted, right? So there's like neurobiology journals, there's coral reef biology journals, there's journals on cardiovascular disease, so like heart disease. So you can kind of think of those as, you know, like Sports Illustrated or Cosmo. And so they're put out usually monthly. Sometimes it's, you know, 4 times a year, but it's usually monthly. There's a table of contents. They publish primary sources, but they'll also publish opinion sources, and they'll also publish secondary sources. So this is where you're going to be pulling your sources from, is from these types of journals, and they're all they're still in print these days, so you can get them like mailed to your usually they would come to your workplace, so they get mailed to me in my lab, but they're also all online, which means that they're searchable and you can find them online. And so we're going to talk about that towards the end. So there's primary sources, and then there's secondary sources, which are going to summarize and synthesize information from primary sources. So these will be, if you're thinking about scientific literature, these are going to be review articles or even a meta-analysis. And I'm going to show you an example of each of those. It could also be a magazine article or a news article. And I was told by your instructors that that is one of your goals for this semester, is that you guys will be writing basically a magazine article that is going to you're going to research primary sources and kind of synthesize an article that you're going to publish in your you know, in one of the Lost in State magazines. So you will be producing a secondary source of information, which is actually really, really awesome. I think that's really cool that you guys get the chance to do that. And then there's even tertiary sources. So they're going to give you kind of a snippet, a really condensed version of this information from primary and secondary sources. So you can think of Wikipedia for that. And you really want to, if you're researching to write a term paper, or even myself, when I go to like write my own publications, I don't ever cite tertiary sources. So I will use primary sources and secondary sources, but I'm not using a tertiary source. Now, where a tertiary source is going to be important for you, and you can talk about this next week, is if you're reading a science paper and you don't know a term. You're like, oh, I don't know what that statistical method is, or I don't know what that piece of equipment is they're talking about. You can do a quick search, you know, quick Google search, and you might go to a Wikipedia page and kind of look at it. And so that's how I use tertiary sources. And I also want you to know, when I read journal articles, because sometimes I'm reading very broadly outside my own expertise, I all the time find things in these journal articles that I don't know. So I have to go kind of look things up. So that's when you'll want to use a tertiary source. So that's an overview. So now we're going to kind of look a little bit deeper. This is the cycle of the scientific literature. So right here, so if I'm going to conduct an experiment, I'm going to first kind of pick my topic, like what is it that I want to research, and then I'm going to conduct the research. In your case, you guys are going to pick a topic of like what type of article you want to write, and then you're going to conduct research in terms of literature searches. And for me, there's a period of where I might share some preliminary data that I've collected at a conference. So I actually just did that last week. I had a national conference that would normally be in person, but instead it was via Zoom. So these things are still happening. And I presented a PowerPoint on my unpublished data. And so then I write my data into a journal article and I submit it for review by other scientists. And the data that I presented at this conference is actually in review at a journal article. So I submitted it, they send it out to other experts in the field who review your research, and then they come back with a list of points that you need to explain better or experiments that you need to do differently in a different way. So they make suggestions. They talk about concerns with your work. And so I've actually gotten my reviews back from this article, and I'm kind of working through my reviews to revise my statistical analyses and revise how I present the data. And we're going to add, I had to go back and do another experiment. So I'm going to add in another figure. And so I'm in this kind of review process. And so hopefully my article will accept my revisions, it'll get published, and then it'll be a primary source of data talking about the gut microbiota and early life stress. And then other reviewers may use my primary source where I did experiments and collected data and I present my conclusions. They may use my primary source in review articles or meta-analyses to kind of talk about how my research fits in with research that was conducted by a whole bunch of scientists. And if you look at all of this research together, what are kind of really big, broad conclusions we can make about the role of gut microbiota in our stress response? And then it might get picked up by other sources like popular news, like CBS News or something, or some local news might pick it up and write an article about it. And it can even, go on to be included in a textbook or something. So that's kind of like the cycle of scientific literature. And again, when you guys are doing your literature searches, you're really going to be looking for primary sources and secondary sources for your research. Okay, so you want to concentrate on primary sources. So these are the data papers. So how do you know when you have found a primary source of literature? Well, you want to look for these parts, and we're going to go through these. So a primary research article is going to have, they're going to have a title, an abstract, usually some introduction, but the kind of main parts you really want to look for are the methods and the results section. So these are always going to be in primary research articles, and they may not be in other type. You might not see a methods and results section in a secondary source. So like a review article. So you really want to look for the methods and results section. And so you can start with the title. Oftentimes that gives you a good clue as to if it's a primary research article or a secondary research article. So the title, it should provide some keywords for you. It's supposed to be free of technical jargon so that any type of scientist or any person can kind of read the title and know what that article is about. And then after the title, you're going to see, when you do these searches, you're going to see some other information about this article. So you're going to see the title, you might see a list of authors, and you might see kind of who those authors are affiliated with. So in my research articles, it has my name, and then it says that I'm in the School of Medicine and the Cardiovascular Division at UAB. So someone reading that can know who I am, what university I work for, or even like what institute you work for, what company you work for. Usually you can get information about the document type. There's often kind of like hyperlinked outline to the article, so you can just go straight to the abstract or straight to the methods. And then there's often a hyperlink to a PDF, so you can just like download a whole file that you can save onto your own computer to look at. So let's look at an example here. So this is an example of a primary research article that when you do a web search for it and you go to the link, this is the journal link. So this was published in the journal Nature Medicine. You can see when it was published. So it's a very recent article that was published this April. It's about respiratory viruses, so viruses that infect the respiratory system and the lungs, and how effective masks are in reducing kind of viral shedding. You can see all the authors here. Now, this is a snapshot that I took, but if you were on the actual webpage for this, you'd be able to like click. I think these are all hyperlinked, so you can click on these and it kind of tells you more about the author, so you can know who they are, where they work. It tells you, like, this is the actual citation, so it's in the Nature Medicine, volume 20, page 676 to 680. So this is all part of the citation. And you can actually click, this is a hyperlink where you would click on it and you could actually download the proper citation. It would be properly formatted for this article. This also tells you that there was a correction to this article, and you can click on that correction and view what was corrected. So now let's talk about the abstract. So for a primary research article, in the abstract, you're usually going to see these elements. It's going to kind of, our authors are going to talk about what they did and why they did it. They might talk a little bit about the methods that they used. They're going to talk about their main results, and then they're going to kind of have a big conclusion, overarching conclusion about what the results mean. So for the same study, let's look at what the abstract looks like. So here's the abstract. Now let's see if we can identify these different kind of sections in the abstract. So why did they do it? How did they do it? What were their results? And what were their kind of main conclusions? And I'll tell you, in this particular abstract, there is one of these parts that's not in here. This is a very, very short abstract. Different journal articles have different limitations on how long an abstract can be. Sometimes they can only be, 250 words or something like that. And so the authors have to be very, very concise, because again, the abstract is just kind of giving you an overview of what this whole paper is about. So, introduction. Why did they do this research project? So in this abstract, they say, we identified seasonal human coronaviruses, influenza viruses, and rhinoviruses in exhaled breath and coughs of children and adults and acute respiratory infections. So that was what they did. So they're kind of missing they didn't really report the methods in this one, but they have their kind of main results. So they found that wearing a mask significantly reduced the detection of influenza virus and respiratory droplets and coronavirus in aerosols. And what's their overall conclusion from this? So they say, and you can kind of look for these keywords, our results indicate. So it's like a key phrase for you to know, okay, this is like the authors think this is like a really important statement. They're pointing it out to me. They're saying, okay, this is what the results mean. It means that surgical face mask could prevent transmission of human coronaviruses and influenza viruses from symptomatic individuals. So when you're searching for sources, you want to look at the title and the abstract to give you kind of an overview of what the article is about. And so after you read the title and the abstract, you can decide, is this interesting to me? Is this going to be useful for my purpose? Do I want to read further? So those are the two things you want to look at first. And again, they're going to give you a clue as to, is this a primary research article or a secondary research article? Okay, so the next main thing you want to look at is, does this paper have a method section and a results section? So the method section gives you information like, where was this done? How was it done? And then some, procedure, more details on the procedures. So let's look at this study again. So this is the method section of the same study. So the method section starts out with study design. So there's kind of these different subheadings. So they say where it was done. Participants were recruited year-round from March 2013 to May 2016 out of a private hospital in Hong Kong. So that's where the study was done. And this is just a snippet. So there's a lot more information after this, but I'm just kind of showing you guys snippets from this paper. So then they go on to talk about how they collected swabs and exhaled breath particles from these patients. And they talk about laboratory testing and the statistical analyses that they did for this research article. And so a primary research article is kind of usually going to have subsections like that, and they're almost always going to have a statistical analysis section to tell you how they analyze their data. So again, these are things you want to look for to let you know you're dealing with a primary research article. The results. So the results section of a primary research article is going to give you the main findings, what did they learn, and how did they learn it. So you're going to see things like, this is again from the same article, you're going to see things like a figure, this figure 1, where they've actually plotted the data into a figure. And then in the results section, we're going to have statements like this. They're going to talk about how they did it. We screened 3,363 individuals. Among these patients, 246 patients, 122 participants were randomized to not wearing a face mask during the first exhaled breath collection, and 124 participants were randomized to wearing a face mask. Okay, so they have a huge number of patients. They took 246 of these, and they divided them to wearing a mask and not wearing a mask. That's kind of an overview of how they did it. And then they have statements like this in the in the results section. We detected coronavirus and respiratory droplets. And they kind of go on to describe their results. So this is what a typical results section is going to look like. It's going to have what they did, kind of a snippet of what they did again that can be reflective of the method section, more information about the results, and figures. They're going to have a discussion section, which is going to, again, to kind of interpret what the results mean. They're going to compare the results to other studies. They're going to talk about the limitations of their studies. So science is meant to be very, very transparent. And so you're usually asked by your reviewers to discuss the limits of your study. And you usually talk about what your next steps are, or what the next steps of anybody who's going to follow up your research should do. So let's look at the discussion from this paper. So they have, like, their discussion starts off with a statement which says, our results indicate that aerosol transmission is a potential mode of transmission for coronavirus as well as influenza viruses and rhinoviruses. And then later in their discussion, they talk about their limitations. The major limitation of our study was the large proportion of participants with undetectable viral shedding and exhaled breath. And then they talk about what could they do next time to overcome these limitations. We could have increased the sampling duration beyond 30 minutes to basically increase their possibility of detecting viruses. And then they give even an alternative approach of how they could have done their study different, or what they might do differently next time. So that's kind of the discussion section of a research article. I will say that research articles don't always, sometimes they'll go abstract, introduction, results, discussion, and the methods will be last. So they don't always kind of go in the typical order you would think of. Sometimes they're a bit switched depending on the journal that you're looking at. Okay, so now let's talk about secondary sources, because you guys will likely want to use some secondary sources as well. And these are still very valid review articles. Peer-reviewed review articles and meta-analyses are still very valid sources of secondary sources to use. So how does a secondary source look different? So these are the parts usually of a secondary source. So they're going to have a title and an abstract again, and they're going to have an introduction, but this time you're not going to see really a methods or a results section. You're going to maybe see like topic headers, and then you'll see kind of a main conclusion and a references. So again, you're not typically going to see a methods section or results section. So this is a journal called Circulation. So this is a journal by the American Heart Association. This is the table of contents for this volume. So this came out in May of this year. So it's volume 141, number 20, May 2020. That's when this journal volume was published. And in this table of contents, you can kind of see different areas. They have a perspective piece. So this is an opinion piece written by a scientist. Then they have original research articles. They have a series of them. And then they have, this is what we're going to look at next. This is actually a review article. And so sometimes if you're having trouble kind of deciding what type of article you're looking at, you can kind of look to see where it's at in that volume of the journal. Is it under original research articles? Is it under review pieces? Is it under opinions, perspectives? So that's going to give you another clue as to what you're dealing with. So we're going to look at this one called COVID-19 and cardiovascular disease. This is a review article. Now, this was a peer-reviewed review article. So it was submitted to this journal of Circulation. It went out to other experts who reviewed this this particular article. So it's still a peer-reviewed source, a peer-reviewed secondary source. And if you're going to use a secondary source, that's really what you want to use. You want to use a peer-reviewed secondary source that's in a journal, like a scientific journal like this, and it's been reviewed. Okay, so if we look at this one, here's the title, COVID-19 and cardiovascular disease. Here's all of the authors again, the abstract. Now, on the webpage, these are all hyperlinks. And so this kind of tells you what's in this journal article, because by just reading the title, you don't really know if it's a review or not. It's hard to tell just looking at that title. But if you look at the parts of this paper, you don't see a method section, you don't see a review section, you see an abstract, and then you see these kind of topics, right? Clinical presentation, COVID-19 in patients with cardiovascular disease, COVID-19 and myocardial injury, and you see a conclusion, an acknowledgement, and some other parts. So that's some of the things that'll help you decipher by looking at kind of these hyperlinks will help you decide, is this a primary or secondary source? Here you can see this would be a link to download the PDF file. So you could actually take this file and save it on your computer and read it later. And then I would say, so this unlock button, this says free access. That means anybody who comes to this webpage can download this article. Sometimes they're going to be behind a firewall. And so what you would need to do is you would need to be logged into the Washington State website, to their kind of like library website, and you would then have access to that journal article to download if Lawson State subscribes to that journal. Okay, so how is an abstract for a secondary source maybe a little bit different than a primary source? So they're going to include the abstract for a secondary source is going to talk about the introduction, why they did it, and then they might talk about the topics and the conclusion, but they're not going to really talk about the methods or results. And you can even see the keywords here. And so when you're doing your literature searches, you're going to use keywords like this. Like if you're interested in COVID and cardiovascular disease, you would put those two words into your search bar, and it would pull up articles like this. So every article includes the authors, when they submit their article, they include keywords to describe their research article that would be picked up in these searches that people do. So when you look at this abstract, you can kind of see they talk about how important coronavirus disease is, and then they start talking about how among patients with COVID-19, there's a high prevalence of cardiovascular disease. They talk about some other aspects of cardiovascular disease. And then they talk about that COVID-19 proposes a challenge for heart transplantation, and that there are a number of promising therapies under which to investigate and treat and prevent COVID-19. So that kind of lets you know some of the things they're going to be talking about in this review article. So again, these are the sections. You can see these are their main topics they're going to talk about. So let's talk about a different type of secondary source. So this is what's called a meta-analysis. You can tell immediately from the title of this journal article that it's probably going to be a secondary source because it says a rapid systematic review. Easy. So it tells you, okay, this is a review, a secondary source of the efficacy of face masks and respirators against coronaviruses. So again, you can see the authors here. There's a link to show more that would show you more information about these authors. If you would click on this little kind of letter right here that actually provides their email address and contact information. And up here, this is the journal that this one was in, the International Journal of Nursing Studies. Again, here's the volume 108 when it was published, and this one is probably what they call an electronic journal. And so it's only available electronically, so there's kind of just a reference number here instead of a page, that it's on page 600 to 615. So it's just going to have kind of an electronic identifier for that journal. Okay, so here is this is the abstract for this journal. So you can see it's formatted a little bit differently. Instead of just being a bunch of sentences together, it's actually divided into sections. And so some journals want their abstracts to be formatted in this way. So it's a little bit of a longer abstract than what we saw before. And you can see some things that would give you a clue as to that this is a special type of a secondary source called a meta-analysis. You see that they have like a methods and a results section. So you're not going to see those in just like a regular review article. You're only going to see those in a meta-analysis. And so a meta-analysis is where you use information from a bunch of other studies and kind of use like a new overarching analysis on these other studies. And so they systematically gathered data from clinical trials, and they talked to you about how they did their literature searches to get these, to get information on these clinical trials, and then they give you some results about what they found. They also give you the aim right here in the background. So that is like a key term that you guys want to look at when you're reading the abstract or reading the introduction. Oftentimes there'll be a statement like this: the aim of this study was to review the evidence around the efficacy of masks and respirators for healthcare workers, sick patients, and the general public. So that's their aim. So when you're kind of gleaning over, trying to decide, do I want to spend time looking at this article, you want to look for statements like that. The aim of this study. And then the conclusion, oftentimes kind of find the aim and the conclusion. And the conclusion is, this study suggests that community mask use by people could be beneficial, particularly for COVID-19, where transmission may be pre-symptomatic. And they kind of give you more information about what they found. So let's look at the other parts of this meta-analysis. So in this article, they have a figure like this. So this figure talks about how they did their literature search to get the clinical trials that they included in this study. So they used these databases for clinical studies called Medline and Embase. They found 602 clinical trials in Medline and 250 with Embase. They excluded papers that didn't meet their search criteria. And so in the end, they were left with 32 clinical trials. They decided of those 13 were not relevant. And in their kind of paper, they go through and talk about, why they decided they were not relevant. And then in the end, in this meta-analysis, there's 19 kind of clinical trials that they looked at. And so they have an overview of their of how they decided to include a clinical trial in this meta-analysis. And this is typical. Something like this is typical of a meta-analysis article. I'm kind of let you know, okay, I'm dealing with a meta-analysis article here. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about these different types of sources, a primary research article versus a secondary review or a secondary meta-analysis, how are you going to find these things? So these days, we don't really go into a library anymore and just pull these things off the shelf. But you don't just do a Google search. That if you just kind of put cardiovascular disease and COVID into a Google search bar, it's going to pull up all kinds of things. It's going to pull up all kinds of sources that are, going to be like tertiary sources, opinion pieces. They're not going to be peer-reviewed scientific articles. So you want to do some specialized searching. It's going to just be a lot easier for you to get the right kind of sources if you do these specialized searches. So don't Google. Instead, you want to use some library databases, and I'm going to show you two that I think are the most helpful. So this kind of lists different sources here. So these would all have web pages where you could go in on that web page and do a search. Your Lawson State Library is going to have its own library database that you can also use to search for journal articles. But what I think is kind of the best way to search for these is to use PubMed. So that is organized by the National Institute of Health, and it's very, very comprehensive, especially for biomedical sciences. So PubMed, which I'm going to show you, or you can use Google Scholar. So this is not just a regular Google search. This is a special kind of, this is a whole different page. So you can see it says Google Scholar up here, and you can customize your Google Scholar webpage in your settings. So you can go under your settings, you can go to library links. And so for me, since I'm part of UAB, and I'm not sure if Lawson State is part of like the whole Alabama system or not, but for me, I have access to everything that UAB subscribes to. So I click on UAB libraries, and then that adds it to my Google Scholar profile. So that when I find a journal article, it then gives me a little button that I can click on that takes me to a UAB specific page that basically lets me get behind the firewall security of that journal article so that I can get access to it. Because remember, some of these are open source, so anybody can just see them, and some of them your university has to subscribe to so that you can get access to it. So here are the two websites. So you guys might want to make notes of those. So let me just pause. I don't know if you guys want to write those down somewhere or not, but this is these are going to be where you guys want to look when you get ready to do this. Yeah, you can take a picture of this, and then I don't know, I mean, it's in my PDF, so I don't know if you each have access to the copy of my PDF. Yeah, definitely take a picture of that. So let's kind of look at each of these and do a search on them. So here's Google Scholar. So this is my Google Scholar that I've already kind of customized it for myself, and you can see that it suggests articles for me to read. You can see all my recommendations here. It's a lot of Coral articles because that's what I looked at previously. Oh yeah, you can't see. I forgot to share the screen. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've ever done
Collaborate. I know.
yeah.
That
So,
circle up there with the
yeah,
little
about
square
that.
stuff, yeah. And go back down to the collaborate panel at the bottom right.
Okay, now you can see my screen.
Yes. Google
Okay.
Scholar.
Okay, now you guys are seeing my Google Scholar. Sorry about that. Okay, so let me start over. So here's my recommended articles. So just like Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or anything recommends things for you guys to look at, Google Scholar does that too based on your research interest. So I've gone in and like put in my research interests. This is based on my dissertation work. I actually need to update it, but it's letting me look at very recent articles that were published on corals and diseases. And then you can see down here, they have this special section for articles about COVID. So this is going to be, if you guys are going to end up writing, you know, something about COVID, this would be a good way for you to get some information. So right here, these are different sources, right? So Nature is, I'll just click on this. So Nature is a really, really good scientific journal. So let's click on this and see what it does for us. So this takes us to Nature Research, and this is a special collection that was published in February 2020 on the coronavirus. And then you can pull up all of these different types of articles right here. And it kind of, just by looking at this, you can kind of tell what they are. Like this is a letter written by a scientist, so this is an opinion piece, not a research article. These ones that say article are probably going to be primary sources, so research experiments. So that's kind of one way that you can find your sources. But the other thing you can do is, let's just say COVID and one thing I want to say do here is you can do something like this. So now I put the asterisks in there, so it's going to pull up anything that starts with like cardio. So COVID and cardiovascular disease, COVID and cardiologists. So let's do that. Now you can see all these different articles that are coming up with the search terms COVID and cardio, and you can see that they're I don't know, are people chatting me? 3 chats. Okay. Okay, so people, have you ever used Google Scholar before? You guys haven't? Okay, so good. So this is new information for you guys. And so now it's pulling up all of these articles. It kind of goes from the most recent, and of course, because COVID is very new, we're not going to have really old articles on this, but you can change the time. Like if you want to look at the most recent articles that were published in 2020, you would set the 2020 limit. If you want to, go back several years, you could click on 2016, or you can even set your range. Now right here, this article has 2 links over here. So this is a PDF that you can click on and they'll pull up the article. Actually, it downloaded it for me. So now we can see the article here. So right up here, it tells you that this is the state of the art review. So we know that this is going to be a review article. Just by looking at this, we know that it was published in the review section of this journal. It has kind of highlights and a summary. So some articles, instead of having an abstract, they'll have a summary like this. And then when you go down and look at it, it looks like a review article, right? You're not seeing, okay, so there's a kind of cartoon, but you're not seeing a data figure. And you're not seeing a method section. You're seeing kind of these different topic headers. So that's going to let you know that that's a review article. The other thing for me, because I set this to my UAB library, is that when I have access to it, I could click on this right here, and this would take me to my, let's see, this takes me to my UAB website, and sometimes there's a link for me to get it. I think this one, well, they're not. Sometimes there would be a link right here that would take me to the journal article. But that's how you can kind of set. I think we did this one. Oh, sometimes it works. Okay, here is something I want to show you guys. Okay, so it can take a long time to get an article published. It has to go through several rounds of reviews and revisions. So for example, I submitted a publication in April, and I got my reviews back a month and a half later, and now I'm working on my revisions, and I'm going to resubmit my article. And by the time it actually gets published, it's going to be a year from when the article gets published. And so what people do now is they'll put them on these preprint servers. So you'll see information like this. And what you want to know is that if it's on a server like this, it hasn't gone through the peer review process yet, but other scientists could comment on this paper. So this is not the finalized version of this paper, and it gives you a warning. This article is a preprint and has not been peer reviewed. And so you may not want to use articles like this until they are published in a real, before they go through the peer review process and get published in another journal. And so when this article gets published, there will be a new link right here that says this article has been accepted into this publication, and here's the final version. And you would go to that final version. So I want to show you PubMed, which is a little bit different. So it works the same way. I put in a couple of search terms. You can go to free full text. And now these are all of the articles that anybody has access to. And you can click on that and it'll take you, to the PubMed website. Right here, this tells you it's a review article. And then this gives you the full text links. So then you can go get that article directly from the journal it was published in. So now here is the journal this article was published in. So PubMed is a really, really easy thing to to use. So now I go to stop sharing. I just had one thing left. So that's how you do your searches. Okay, so you found your sources using PubMed or using Google Scholar. So now what? So this is a really good tool. It's called the CRAP test. So this helps you kind of evaluate the source that you found. Is the source recent? Does it have information about the latest advances and ideas? Or is the source really old and outdated? Let me see. Yeah. So is the source directly related to your topic? Is it going to help support your argument for whatever you're going to be writing? Or is the source really tangential and unrelated to your topic? Is the author a known expert in the field for that topic? So that's where you'd kind of want to look at the authors, and you can go look to see, oh, you know, this is a professor of cardiovascular disease at Harvard, or this is a professor of viral diseases at Stanford. You know, so you can look at your sources. Is the author unknown or not an expert, or even are they paid, you know, are they part of a company that produces vaccines? You kind of want to know that information. Are the facts correct and backed up by citations and sources? So that's what you're going to see in peer-reviewed primary and secondary sources. They're going to list their references. It's going to be very, very organized, and you can go look to see, you know, the references that they cite. Or are they citing other types? Are they not citing primary sources? Like if this is a review, are they citing other news articles and they're not citing primary scientific research articles? What is the purpose of this article? You want to kind of know, like, why did the people do this study? Do they have conflicts of interest? Conflicts of interest have to be made public on any research article. And so that's kind of where I wanted to end today. My original idea was to have you guys decide, like, practice using Google Scholar or PubMed on your own. But I don't think we have time for that because it's almost 2. So if you guys have any, let me stop sharing here. If you guys have any specific questions for me on how to do this, you can ask them now, either through the chat or unmuting yourself. Next week, you guys are going to get, we kind of did an overview of the sections that are in these type of articles, but next week, you're going to actually get practice with reading a scientific article and, like, how would you go about reading it and getting information out of it.
Well, scholars, let's thank Dr. Kemp for that. That was great information, Dr. Kemp. Very good, very good.